All right, so we're at week 9, and as you probably know, there are 4 more sessions left of our class, and the last day, which will be primarily a review session. So we're really talking about 3 more sessions left. There's still a bit of work that we need to get through, and it'll be a slight shift in tone as well as, I think, direction in the class the next couple of weeks. And I'll explain a little bit about what that will entail in a second. I wanted to make a couple remarks just following up on the visit last Thursday by Dana Schwartz. I appreciate, and I'm sure she does as well, the attentiveness with which you listened to her story. And also a number of students talked to her afterwards. She was very gracious, I think, as well as appreciative of the questions that people asked. A number of students also asked me if they wanted to send her an email to thank her for coming, or just they had questions. She does actually have an email, and was more than I called her on the phone and asked her if she wanted to continue a conversation, and she said she was more than happy to do so over email. And so if that's something that you are interested in, I'm happy to pass her email along to you, and you can send me an email about that. I'm sure she doesn't want to be overwhelmed probably with emails. However, she said that she would enjoy hearing from students, and sometimes after hearing a story like that, it may be difficult to come up and ask questions in public, but maybe you did have questions, and she's willing to continue the conversation. So I did want to put that out there. Second thing I wanted to say about her visit, well, actually 2 things. There were 2 things she didn't tell you, and I thought that these were, they weren't really footnotes to her conversation, but really, I think, very central things that didn't get a lot of explication, but I thought I would mention them. One, she was a graduate of UCLA. I don't know if she said that she went here, but she attended school at UCLA. And I thought that was remarkable given the journey that she had come on. And the second thing that I wanted to say, and I don't think she spent much time, but she did indicate this, about what happened to her father. She said, of course, what happened to her mom and herself and how they managed to escape, live in the underground, eventually migrate to the United States. Her father was killed, and she didn't really go into this, but he was brought outside the city center where she grew up after being found in hiding. He was shot, and as far as she knows, this was the fate that that befell most of the people who were still found in the ghetto. She pointed out the numbers of how many people survived. Very few did. Around 1,000 out of 300,000, considering the entire city and the environs. And her father was one of the victims. He was apparently shot by one of essentially the Einsatz commando groups, buried in a mass grave. She doesn't know where he died. But one of the things she did with her mom after the war is she went back to the location and she gathered some sand from the area outside the city where most likely her father was buried. And that's basically what she had. It was quite moving, and she told me that afterwards. So I wanted to pass that along to you because you may have wondered, what had happened to her father, and that was the fate. Okay, so today we're shifting gears a little bit to talk about issues of what I was calling transgenerational memory. And by transgenerational memory, I mean memory that goes simply across generations. In many ways, it's what we're engaged with. It's what I'm engaged with. And it's particularly about issues of memory regarding people who weren't there, people who weren't themselves eyewitnesses to the events that they were talking about. And so here we're talking about issues of reception, how information and history is passed on, and how it's made sense, how we make sense of it, how it becomes meaningful for us, or possibly it doesn't become meaningful to us. So the way in which it signifies or sometimes fails to signify. And we'll look at a piece today. I'll spend most of the lecture talking about Bernard Schlink's novel, The Reader. And this is a very different piece of Holocaust literature than what we've dealt with before. One, because it is a work of literature. That is to say, it's not a historical document. It's not a memoir. It's not a documentary based on testimony of someone who actually saw things or did things, but it's a work of literature possibly, and Schlink is somewhat ambiguous about this, possibly inspired by his own life story. This is not to say that it's completely fabricated, but it's also to say that it's not entirely a historical work either. It has this kind of ambiguous status of somewhere between the fictive, the literary, the invented, the imagined, and the real being the historical, the events that actually happened. Now, there's a fundamental part of this novel which is based on historical reality. That is to say, there were trials that took place of SS guards in 1965, which is when, as hopefully you read, the protagonist is put on trial. We could presume that people lived ordinary lives in Germany after the war. We know of that, and we could also imagine that much of the historical material in the novel is based on real historical events. But we don't know, and it is subtitled The Reader, a Novel at the very top here. What we don't know is exactly how much is in fact made up, and we have to wonder if that's even relevant for our conversation here. Because we can ask, what a work of literature can do for our understanding of the Holocaust, and especially one which does cross generational borders. The main character, hopefully as you know, was born in 1944. And so he was not a perpetrator, he was not a victim, he was not a bystander, he was a baby at the end of the war, and so had no relationship to the events that unfolded in Nazi Germany. And so what's the significance of that perspective, of being born in a country that's torn by war, that committed some of the greatest crimes, certainly in the history of humankind? What's your relationship to those events? How do you inherit this history? And the inheritance, of course, is a very weighty thing, to figure out your responsibility and your relationship to this history. So that, I think, are some issues that are at stake. On Thursday, just to go to other things we'll look at Ruth Kluger's large portions, not the entire thing, although I highly recommend, if you're interested in reading her entire memoir, Still Alive, you can purchase it at the bookstore. It's available, obviously, online. I excerpted significant parts in the course reader for our class. And I had mentioned already in the past that one of the significant things about this memoir is that it details a mother-daughter relationship and could be seen as a kind of parallel in some ways to the father-son relationship in Elie Wiesel's Night. It also is that she was in many of the same places as Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel. She was in a work camp called Buna, which was outside of Auschwitz. She managed to escape, and actually very similar to the story that Dana Schwartz talked about on Thursday. She basically assumed a new identity with her mom, living in a German town during the end of the war, and in fact got false papers, and as a Jew lived essentially as a Christian, as a German in a town, and essentially had this very unique perspective of being both a victim, but in some ways also someone who was saved, who could also see from the perspective of the people who were non-Jews, because she got to live essentially a new identity for this brief period of time. And she talks about this and in a very, I think, powerful way. The reason I consider this a kind of transgenerational memory is that she wrote her memoir very late in life. That is to say, she wrote it decades after the experiences, and she talks a lot about her mother, her relationship to her mom, and also her own relationship to understanding the meaning of the Holocaust for her personally. And it was something that she, at different points in her life, and the memoir goes over many decades. It ends in the present, in the year 2001, I believe, where she's teaching here in the University of California system. She's a professor emerita in Irvine. And so I'll talk a little bit about her life story as well, because I think it'll be a powerful example about this issue about memory that spans generations. With regard to Spiegelman, this is also the case of what we could call second-generation memory. It's the memory of the children of Holocaust survivors. Art Spiegelman, if you've looked at the book Maus, it's a graphic novel. It's an illustrated story, and a large part of it is about the way in which he's coming to terms with the story of his parents and his relatives in New York City after the war, and beginning to understand the significance of this story. So the way in which the story is passed down, the way in which it's encountered, and the way in which he's struggling to understand, his own identity based on understanding where his parents came from. So that's Tuesday and Thursday. We're going to have a film screening of the last film. I realized that Sunday's Oscars, and Jackie reminded me as much. So we're not going to do it then because maybe you want to watch the Oscars. But we will do it Monday, Monday night. I think it'll be 7 o'clock. It'll either be here or in another theater-like space. I haven't got confirmation yet. This is not a terribly long film. It's about an hour and 20 minutes, so it's I don't think it's particularly arduous in terms of your time commitment. But I definitely recommend seeing it. It's called Paragraph 175. And one of the reasons that, or the main reason that I'm showing it, is because it documents the history of gay and lesbian victims of the Nazi genocide who were targeted because of their sexuality. So not people who happened to be gay and lesbian and were a victim because they were Jews, but people who were specifically targeted based on their sexual orientation and forced to wear a pink triangle or a black triangle, indicating their particular, their particular target. So we'll talk about that and also talk a little bit about other victims of the Nazi genocide. And this will take us really towards the end of class. Good. So questions at all? The last day of class, by the way, I'll review for the final exam, but also talk about, show you sample final exam questions in class and talk about that. The final is scheduled for Wednesday here during final exam week from 3 to 6, I believe. You will bring blue books. I would expect you to allot yourself the 3 hours. It may not take you 3 hours, but I would give yourself the 3 hours. I haven't written the final exam yet, but the structure will primarily be short essays and maybe longer essays. It won't be kind of facts and figures or multiple choice questions like that. I'm not interested in those kind of things. Although I would expect you to have an understanding of the historical material we've covered, and so there's certainly key dates and names that you would need to know. It's not a test about your facts and figures, but I would expect that you have some knowledge of those things. Okay? So, that's it. Anything else? Questions? Logistical things otherwise? No? Alrighty. So we're going to turn to Bernard Schlink's The Reader. And I'm hoping that we can actually have a little bit more of a discussion than we normally have about things that we've talked about in class. I'm more than happy to lecture on this, and I will lecture on The Reader. But I also am interested in your input, because this is a very different, really I think it's a very different type of document than what we've ever read before in class. Like I said before, it's not a historical document. It's a novel. And insofar as it's a novel, it fits within the realm of the imaginary. Of course, the realm of the imaginary is not the realm here of science fiction, of things that happen on other planets or things that are very distant and kind of unrelated. They're things that obviously do have a connection to the material we've been talking about, obviously the Holocaust, and also, I think, raise very fundamental questions about perpetrators, victims, issues of forgiveness, issues of redemption, and in many ways, I think, begin to complicate our understanding of what or who a perpetrator is. I'll begin by asking you a question, because I imagine that not everybody, although I hope everybody in the class has read the novel, all 218 pages of it. I very much hope you have. But I am a realist and a pragmatist, and I know that not everyone had a chance to read every single page. So I'm going to ask you, not so much to write down your names, but because I think that your perspective will actually differ based on how much of this novel you've read, and I don't want to reveal everything that happened. So I'm going to ask for hands. How many people really didn't finish it? You really didn't. Come on. You say, really didn't. Everyone else did finish it. You finished the whole thing. Okay, so the people who didn't finish it, I have a question for you. Did you get through most of the first part? How many got through most of the first part, like the first 50, 60 pages? Only a couple. How many people didn't open it at all? All right. You're so proud. I didn't open it. Good. Well, I would encourage you to open it, and I'll make sure that the TAs have a record. I would encourage you to open it. But the people who began to read the novel, your perspective on this novel is going to be different, I believe, than people who actually finished it. It's a strange novel in a lot of ways because the first 80 or so pages are primarily, they're about a sexual love relationship. One which I think would figure in this, I think the word taboo is perfectly appropriate here, given it's a relationship between a woman who's 36 years old and a boy who's 15. This is already something transgressive in this relationship, in that the boy is not of age, and the woman is more than twice his age. And not only that, it's extremely graphic. One could even say it's somewhat pornographic in its detail. And so it begins to raise a question, at least for me, and I hope it raises this question for you, which is why the author spends so much time, 83 pages of this novel, detailing a very strange, possibly taboo sexual relationship between an older woman and a younger boy who's still in high school. How does this add to our understanding of the Holocaust? Why is Professor Presner thinking we should read 83 pages about this taboo sexual relationship in a class about the Holocaust? Why? What in the world is this about? And I mean, anyone who even read the novel, if you read the whole thing, can also help us understand this. But it's an interesting question. I mean, most novels about the Holocaust, or most memoirs, certainly most memoirs we've read, they start off pretty much towards the point where the protagonist or the person who's writing the memoir has entered into the Holocaust. That is to say, they've become deported or they've become put in a ghetto. Something's happened to them. Even when we looked at the perpetrators, what we've looked at is precisely those moments in which they were engaged in whatever actions they were engaged in, like the Wannsee Conference, or in the case of the film Franz Suchomel, we learned about exactly the deeds that he did. What do you think? No. Sure. I mean, first of all, there's a couple of things that you said. Most of the things that we've been looking at happened between 1933 and 1945. Those are the years of Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany surrendered May 8th, 1945. Essentially, almost all of the victimization was done at that point. Not all. And in fact, there's a significant number of things that happened after the war, as people know, which is about the amount of displacement that happened. People in displaced camps, people struggling to find their homeland, continued anti-Semitism after the war, especially in Poland and other countries, even in Germany. So the issue of trying to find perpetrators, bring them to trial, this is all going on after 1945. In the case, and I think I'll just mention this as a footnote right now, in the case of homosexual victims of the Nazis, they were actually re-imprisoned after the war for the same crimes they were imprisoned for during the Nazi period, which is the only group after the war to be re-imprisoned based on their identity after the war. This is an interesting footnote, but I'll spend time talking about that next week. But it's worth knowing. Jewish victims, other victims, were not re-imprisoned because they were Jews after 1945, whereas homosexual men were. And in fact, the numbers are almost the same before the war as after the war, which just tells you something about the climate. That's a footnote, but it's a kind of indication about next week. But to go back to your point about 1945, it's important that the landscape, as you said, of post-1945 Germany was a place where people were, one, searching for justice, trying to find perpetrators, trying to bring them to justice. We've already seen this with regard to Peter Weiss's play. We saw this with regard to the Nuremberg trials. But there's also an issue of people were being born who were neither perpetrators nor victims. That is to say, they were born essentially innocent of those actions that had characterized people who were born during the Nazi, or before or during the Nazi period. So it's like, what perspective do these people have? In the case of Michael Berg, who's the protagonist and the reader, he's born in 1944. He has no memories of what happened, and he also has no involvement. And the relationship that he begins to develop with Hannah here is one that's certainly strained, it's difficult, it's sexual, but it's also in some ways tense. And it's one in which he basically is beginning to ask questions about her in order to learn something about her past, because it's a past that he does not share, right? He doesn't have the same past as she does. And that's important. And that's sort of the basis, I think, of this entire first 83 pages, is the fact that they have two different memories. They have two different pasts, two different understandings. And so, when he asked this relatively simple question early on page, I think it's page 39, he says, what had she done during the army? She lived in Berlin. What did she do in the army? And she responds, the things you ask, kid, like those things, like, the things you want to know. I mean, I'm not going to tell you about those things. But it's the only indication that maybe her past is not the same as his past. But to go back to the question, why spend so much time detailing this very long, sexually provocative relationship in which, they basically spend their days, as she says, making love, taking baths, having sex, reading. Why detail this for 1/3 of this Holocaust novel? Okay, so you've indicated something about where the novel goes, which is the a kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say transformation, but an awareness that Michael has later on about who Hannah is, and the fact that the first 83 pages provide you with one perspective of who she is, and the remainder of the novel provide you with a very different perspective of who she is.
I definitely agree that the purpose of the fascination of both characters, not necessarily
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think you're right about the issue of her mystery and the kind of the depth of the sort of depth of knowledge that he gains over time. And there's a certain, I wrote seductive and this deeply close personal relationship. There's something also profoundly humanizing about it. And I think that's also really important. They have a relationship, and it's based on, he says how much he loved her. Jacob, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just want to say that maybe it shows also that even though when you were born, usually leading after the war, how it still goes with that person, like when, like maybe she is not maybe like a protagonist only, but she also presents the memories of that, and she completely changes his life. So like history, even though he was not part of that history, completely changes his life.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I'm going to write it like this: his life becomes profoundly intertwined with hers. This is actually, I think, perhaps the most, I would say it's a very profound observation on your part, because the entire novel, as much as it's also about Hannah Schmitz and discovering who she is and what she did and her trial, it's also about Michael Berg learning about who she is and the fact that his entire life becomes bound up with her life, right? From the age 15 all the way to the end, which he's 50 years old. And in fact, he's, as you may know if you finish the novel, he's not able to really have personal relationships with other women. He gets divorced, he has children, but yet he still is connected to her in some kind of very deep and profound and maybe mysterious way. Perhaps it's through the fact that he knows about her, he learns more about her, but their two lives become intertwined. It's almost like the just chance encounter, right, which begins the entire thing. Just imagine the chance encounter of someone just helping you because you're sick one day and you're throwing up and just begins to take care of you, and suddenly your entire life becomes intertwined with this other person's life and all the things that she went through. So it's I think you're exactly right, that in this way, it's not the first 83 pages of the novel, as much as it's about a relationship between the boy and the older woman, it's actually setting the stage for a lifelong relationship that he has, and one that he struggles with constantly to understand who she is, and you could even go more broadly to understand the inheritance of, Nazi Germany, for people who weren't there. That is to say, any person born after 1945 can begin to ask many of the same questions, asking of your grandparents, of your parents, what did you do? What did you see? What did you know? These kind of questions are very profound, and suddenly your life becomes wrapped up with the answers that you get. Also go back to this point here, because this comes back, I think, throughout, and we're still, only on part one. There's something profoundly humanizing about the relationship. This is not a relationship based upon all those things about dehumanization that we had talked about earlier in the quarter, but this is actually a relationship largely based, at least from his perspective, on love, on a kind of sexual encounter. And when it has moments that, break that apart, and there are moments of violence that he experiences, it's those things that he somehow can rationalize or understand, or he still tries to come to terms with them. I mean, we get small indications that something's wrong, right? I mean, do you remember, besides the fact that she doesn't answer, what did you do during the war, are there any other indications in the first part that there's maybe something slightly off about Hannah? Yeah.
Well, like when he leaves her at breakfast,
Mm-hmm.
and he writes that note, and she thinks that he's left or something, and he comes back and she hits him and makes him bleed all over, and then she starts sobbing on him. It's kind of like this emotional instability you see, where she's mad, completely mad one minute, and then the next minute she wants, she loves him again.
Right. Yeah, so it's kind of this sort of seemingly bipolar, perhaps, kind of, yeah. She always does what? Yeah, and she obsessively takes baths. It's interesting. If to read this kind of symbolically, an idea of purging, right? An idea of constantly bathing, a sense of cleansing. And I would definitely think this is, it's a novel. After all, we can address these things on a symbolic level. I think the idea that they're constantly bathing together probably symbolizes something about coming to terms with the past. He representing a kind of purity of not having these experiences, of not having been, a Nazi. Her kind of obsessively bathing, and in many ways pursuing a relationship with him, which is possibly part of her own redemption as a person. Coming to terms in some ways with, as a kind of level of a personal redemption, but I think there's also a level of a sort of legal redemption, and that only happens, in the second part of the novel. So I'll just write that here. Good. Anything else that sort of strikes us as odd about her from the first part, or anything else you want to say? Right. That's the taboo aspect, right? That really strikes us as odd. But I think in many ways we might have an answer for that. And it might just simply be that Michael represents something pure. He doesn't have the same contaminated memories. He doesn't have the same contaminated experiences. He was never a perpetrator. And if we want to consider this novel about her own personal redemption, and I think the novel is largely about her redemption as the attempt to kind of make good on what she did, Michael is absolutely critical in this transformation, absolutely critical. And so on every level, whether it's sexual love, but also the reading, and eventually the kind of ongoing relationship they have throughout his whole adult life. All right. So let's go to the second part. So it's still the same question, who Hannah Schmitz is, because I think it changes. And in many ways, if that's the first question that we had here, who is Hannah Schmitz, when we see part one, we see her in a certain way, a certain light. But when we ask the same question in part two, I think it's somewhat different. And the first question that I basically have is, at what point does this become a Holocaust novel? At what point do we get away from it being kind of this sexual, pornographic, transgressive, and when does it become, it's a Holocaust novel? What happens? When does that happen? Do you know? When would you say? People who read the whole thing? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Right. So you get exactly. You get this one. Remember, the novel starts in 1958 because that's the. If you just add up the years, it starts in 58. Part 2 begins essentially in 1965. And at that point, he's in college, he's in law school. He's beginning to study issues around law. He's also working with a professor who is studying the trials that were going on in post-war Germany of Holocaust perpetrators. And one of the central trials that was going on this period, as you already know, was the Auschwitz trial, taking place in 1965. So it's no coincidence that Schlink talks about going to those trials. He may, in fact, very well have been there. And these trials take place, the same exact ones that Peter Weiss documents in the investigation, the second Auschwitz trials. And remember, these are different than the first Auschwitz trials in that these were primarily focused on low-ranking and middle-ranking SS officers. And so someone like Hannah Schmitz, it would make sense that she was brought to trial in one of these later trials. She wasn't one of the key, most high-ranked guards who orchestrated the entire thing. She was essentially, a functionary at the middle level, and she played various roles. As we find out, she had worked for a brief period of time in Auschwitz and then had worked outside in a camp outside of Krakow, where she played a role which brought her to trial. So it largely becomes a Holocaust novel, I'd say, on page 90, which is where the second chapter of the second part starts off and says, "When I saw Hannah again, it was in a courtroom. It wasn't the first trial dealing with the camps, nor was it one of the major ones." And then he goes on to talk about his professor who was studying the crimes and that he was part of a seminar and began to attend the trial. So, what is she on trial for? What does she do? What is she on trial for? Yeah? Right. So something happened towards the end of the war when the Allies were bombing were basically bombing many German cities, also areas in Poland. As the war drew to a close, these bombings took place by airplane, and sometimes strategic targets were bombed, like railway stations and other things. Sometimes, as it turned out, churches and other things were bombed. One of the things that happened was that there were a number of Jewish prisoners that Hannah Schmitz and a number of other SS officers had to oversee. They were prisoners of war. They were prisoners because they were Jewish. They were locked in a church at some point in order to keep them from escaping. When bombs hit the church caught on fire. There were keys in the door where they could have let the prisoners out, but in fact, everyone except 2 people burned to death in the church. And she's on trial largely for an inaction, which is she could have let the people out, but she didn't. And in fact, I don't remember exactly how many died according to the novel, but I think several hundred perished in a fire. Is there anything else that she's on trial for? Do you remember? I mean, what the charges are against her? Yeah.
She also sent the weakest women from the other camp where she was to Auschwitz.
So she protected them. So there were these moments where she was involved apparently in selection of prisoners. So it's detailed that she was also brought up on charges of being involved in the selection of prisoners. And as you know from the history of the Holocaust, we know that the weakest, the ones who had been most sick, malnourished, and so forth, who couldn't work because she was part of overseeing a concentration work unit, those women were selected essentially selected for the gas chambers. And so there may have been that she played a role in selecting these women. I think that's one part of it. But there's another interesting part of it, is that she apparently knew which women were going to be selected because they were weak, and she actually had them, you might remember, read to her. So actually at one point the novel says that she actually selected these women herself, not for death, but rather kind of took them aside almost under her wing in a sense in order to make their last month of life or so more bearable, and had asked them, asked basically to read to her. But she's accused of participating in the selection.
Wasn't there a motive on her part that those children she knew were going to be killed, and that would keep her secret, that she couldn't read the secret?
Mm-hmm.
Because she didn't want those children to survive.
You could say that there was also another very personal motivation for choosing these children to read to her. And something that becomes revealed in the course of the novel is that something about Hannah Schmitz is very important for her own sense of self. It's not so much that she was an SS officer, but what becomes revealed is that she's illiterate, that she can neither read nor write. This becomes a very important point in the entire novel, because basically the confession that she's supposedly had made, a written confession, couldn't have possibly been written by her because she was illiterate, right? I mean, she couldn't have possibly confessed to the crimes that she confessed to, or that the others said that she confessed to, because they're a written confession, and it turns out that she was illiterate. And this begins to explain something else about the novel, why in the first part, Michael Berg and Hannah Schmitz have this relationship based on, certainly sex and love, but it's also a relationship based on reading, right? And after all, it's called The Reader, right? I mean, the reader here is Michael Berg. It's a person who is reading to someone else. And presumably, there are other readers too, which are people like the women selected to read to her before they were killed. And so there are other readers too. Good. So what about at her trial? I mean, at what point, do we begin to understand her as a perpetrator? I mean, and this is, I think, a really central question, because I think that the picture that Bernard Schlink paints of Hannah Schmitz is a somewhat different picture than the perpetrators that we've been looking at in class. The perpetrators we've been looking at in class, and I guess say, just to remind you, like Adolf Eichmann, the Wannsee Conference, Karl Hocher, Franz Suchemel from Shoah. These are the perpetrators that we've been looking at. I believe that Hannah Schmitz is different. And it may not just have to do with the fact that she's a woman and they're men, although maybe that's part of it. But I believe there's other aspects that also differentiate her from these other perpetrators. What do you think that is? Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, I think on one part it's just even her trial. I mean, there's a certain amount of confusion on her part. There's a confusion about the charges, the legal processes, and it's kind of always punctuated with this very, I think, profound and difficult question, which she asks of the judge, which is, what would you have done, right? Like if you were in my shoes and you had been given this charge, you had to watch over these prisoners, you had to guard this camp, you had to select these prisoners, meaning if you don't do it, you too could be potentially maybe shot or penalized or whatnot. You were part of, what Eichmann calls the big cog. He was a cog in the machine, he says, or he was just making the trains run on time, and other people would say, I'm one person. In many ways, she could make the same claim, but she doesn't quite say that. She doesn't quite say, I didn't have any choice. I think she recognizes in some ways that she may have had choice, but she turns the question back to the judge. And I think this is really interesting. In as much as the people on trial at the Nuremberg trial, we saw them, they almost don't even engage with the legal system. 9, I'm not participating in this. Are you guilty or innocent? No, I'm not even going to answer this question. She basically turns the question around, right? And she's asked, repeatedly, what would you have done? If you were in my situation, what would you have done? And it's a really profound question, right? It's almost basically saying, imagine yourself in my shoes with the knowledge that you have, how would you have behaved? What kind of way would you have risked your own life, your job, your sense of self, all these other things? And, it's a question, I think, really motivated by a sort of search to understand, what she did, but also how she's culpable or responsible. So what would you have done, right? So she says this. I'll just read a couple of passages because I think it's actually quite interesting. So like if you look during the trial, the judge asks her, about the report that was written. And we already know at this point, or at least maybe in the novel, get a sense that she's not able to read and write. We know something about her. And one of the other defendants, she's not the only defendant on trial here, there are a group of other women who are also on trial. One of them point to Hannah and say, she's the one who wrote the report. She's the guilty one. She did it all. And she wanted to use the report to cover it up and drag us into it. This is on page 126. And that's said by, one of the other defendants to try to frame Hannah, make her the sole bearer of the guilt and responsibility. And so the judge asked Hannah, but it was just this last question. His first was, why did you not unlock the doors? And Hannah says, we had, she stumbles, Hannah was groping for an answer. We didn't have any alternative. You had no alternative? Some of us were dead and the others had left. They said they were taking the wounded to the field hospital and would come back. But they knew they weren't coming back, and so did we. Perhaps they didn't even go to the hospital. The wounded were not that badly hurt. And she goes on, the judge asked, what did you do? We didn't know what to do. It all happened so fast. With the priest's house burning and the church spire and the men in the cart there, 1 minute and gone the next, and suddenly we're alone with the women in the church. They left behind some weapons, but we didn't know how to use them, and even if we had, what good would it have done, since we were only a handful of women? How could we have guarded all those women? She asks. A line like that isn't very long, even if you keep it as tight together as possible. Then Hannah paused. Then the screaming began and got worse and worse, and we had opened the doors, and if we had opened the doors, they had all come rushing out. The judge waited a moment and asked her, were you afraid? And she says that they would know, but how could they have restored order? They would have been chaos, and we would have to handle that. They would have tried to escape. A little later on page 128, the next slide, she says, Hannah realized that what she was saying wasn't doing her any good, but she couldn't say anything else. She could only try to say what she was saying better, to describe it better, explain it. But the more she said, the worse it looked for her. Because she wasn't at her wit's end, she turned to the judge again. Because she was at her wit's end, she turned to the judge again. What would you have done? She asked. So this constant kind of sense of, she's explaining her situation, she's talking about what she did, she's afraid that if she had unlocked the church door, all these women would have come running out. They were the only few guards that were there. There's a sense of kind of duty and responsibility, but also a sense of, real struggle about, okay, what would have been the right thing to do? Is there any, could I have done anything else, in this situation? And then she finally just confesses. She basically, in a sense, I think breaks down or doesn't want the secret revealed that she's illiterate, and she just confesses, I admit I wrote the report. Mm-hmm. Right. It's a great question. Just to repeat it, just so people can hear. You said, at the end, if Eichmann was presented in such a way as, learning about his wife and children and whole kind of personal history, all the way up through what he did and then into the, post-war period, would we feel different? Is the novel largely eliciting our sympathy towards Hannah because of the way in which it's set up, essentially? Right. The sense of guilt, again, that she feels. It's interesting that, they even explain a little bit, or Schlink does in the novel, why she went to the SS. And she went largely, again, out of this feeling of shame about her illiteracy, right? Because she would have been offered a promotion at Siemens if she had stayed there. He says on 132, just a little bit later, that there was a reason why she went to the SF, that she had actually been granted a promotion at Siemens and she didn't want it. That's why she was admitted to the writing report in order to escape a confrontation with an expert. Her secret would have essentially come out. The idea here being that had she learned to read or write, maybe became educated, perhaps she wouldn't have become a Nazi. It's a kind of strange idea because, on the other hand, we know that many of the Nazis were extremely educated, right? They were not only literate in terms of reading and writing, they were very schooled, very educated. They had JDs, PhDs, or the equivalent. All the men at the Wannsee Conference, with actually the exception of Eichmann, had higher education. So it's not as if learning to read and write would prevent you from becoming a Nazi, but at least within her sort of world, that had been this closely guarded secret that in fact had sort of we can then begin to understand the series of steps that led to her entering the SS and eventually confessing, and finally also the basis of her redemption, if we see it as redemption, the basis in which she began to actually atone for what she did. After all, and this I think is what's perhaps the most moving part of the novel, is that she reads essentially the literature that we read in the class. I mean, she basically reads Holocaust literature in her jail cell after the war. And, I can't imagine from the perspective of Eichmann or Suchenbauer or any of these other people that they're reading and trying to confront from the perspective of the victims what they did. And yet that's exactly what Hannah does. And so again, it kind of underscores this other point, which is, we begin to sympathize with her more and more, not only because we learned about her life story and this kind of trajectory that led to where she is, we begin perhaps to see her somewhat as a victim, but we also perhaps sympathize with her because of her attempts, I think, to redeem herself by honestly confronting the victims. Mm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. I think that's a good point. I mean, you're right that the men in the Wannsee Conference were generally very high-ranking. They're very educated. They kind of very privileged, you said. She didn't have quite the same privilege. I mean, she didn't obviously have schooling, and she certainly wasn't rich. She wasn't particularly powerful. She didn't have a particularly high-ranking position. She didn't have a lot of people working, on her behalf or looking out for her. And so all these things, she's a profoundly isolated figure in some ways. And the only way in which I think that isolation is overcome is actually through the figure of Michael Berg and the relationship that they have, right? Otherwise, she's almost like this kind of atomized figure that, has this, horrible thing that she did, and now she's on trial, but she becomes humanized through the very process of us finding out about her background, her motivations, her secret, and her relationship with another, human being. Mm-hmm.
You would do your job.
Right.
And I think that that's what she has in common with many of the other classes.
Mm-hmm.
They all said they were doing their job.
Yeah, in that regard, you're right. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, not to, excuse her by any means, but, she was exactly that. She was doing her job, and that was often the defense that was used by plenty of other perpetrators that, I was following orders, I was doing my job, I was doing what I was told, I was listening to my superiors. And, she says sort of as much, but I think in the fact that she turns the question around, she also, and the judge doesn't answer the question, she at least is engaging with a kind of taking the situation, I think, both seriously, but also trying to understand, like, what she should have done, right? So in asking it, in a subjunctive, what would you have done, it also implies, what should I have done, right? It implies those two things. So let's talk about part 3. So what happens in part 3? And this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, I'll have to end up giving the whole novel away for those of you who haven't read it, but alas, we will. But she goes, she's sentenced to jail. She's sentenced to life in prison for her role in the burning of these women and children in the church, and for her role, ostensibly in her role with the selection. She serves actually not... She doesn't serve her entire sentence, life in prison, although that's what she's given. She, in fact, serves 18 years. And in the course of these 18 years, she continues to have the relationship with Michael. The relationship, of course, is not based on, sex any longer, but it's based on communication. And the communication is that he creates tapes, cassette tapes of books that he's read, essentially like books on tape, sends them to her, and she learns to read. Basically, she essentially learns how to read and write based on these cassette tapes that he sends to her. She gets the novels from the library and I guess in the jail. She has the cassette tapes, and she eventually responds with a letter to him where she can actually, write. So by the end, she's actually accumulated the ability to read and write. Shortly before she's, after 18 years of service, Michael Berg gets a letter from the prison warden saying that she's actually been paroled. She's been paroled for good behavior. She's spent her time. She's aged significantly. And Michael is actually the only person who knows her. She doesn't have any family. It goes back to that issue that she's a very isolated person, and her whole connection, I think, with other human beings is largely, through Michael. He's going to help her reacclimate to society after she gets out of prison. He goes there on the day to pick her up, that she's to be released, and she finds out from the prison warden, and here's a spoiler, she's hung herself. She's killed herself. So towards the end of the novel, she actually commits suicide, and in fact, never goes back into the greater society. But in the meantime, what happens, and this I think is really the part of the novel that's really quite extraordinary, is that, and this is starts on page 204, 205. Michael tells the warden that she was illiterate, and that he actually he figures out that she had learned to read and write based on the cassette tapes that he had sent back and forth. And then on 205, he goes to her prison cell, and he looks around. And this is on 205, the top. He said, "I went over to the bookshelf," and so this is the bookshelf in her prison cell. And what does he find? He finds Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, Tadeusz Borowski, Jean Amoret, the literature of the victims, next to the autobiography of Rudolf Hess, Hannah Arendt's report on Eichmann in Jerusalem, and scholarly literature on the camps. And he asks this really strange question, right? Did Hannah read these? Well, the warden says, at least she ordered them with care. Several years ago, I had to get her a general concentration camp bibliography. And then 1 or 2 years ago, she asked me to suggest some books on women in the camps, both prisoners and guards. I wrote to the Institute for Contemporary History, and they sent me a specialized bibliography. As soon as Frau Schmitz learned to read, she began to read about the concentration camps. So it raises an extraordinary question, right? I mean, this is, I think, again, is that central question about, almost the haunting question that I think we have with regard to looking at the perpetrators, listening to Franz Suchemel sing the Treblinka song. Could you imagine him reading Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, Borowski, Jean Amoret, Hannah Arendt's report on Eichmann? I mean, not really. You almost imagine a kind of smug arrogance, a kind of, I get to continue with my life, not a kind of sense of, I'm redeeming myself. So can she redeem herself? I mean, can she atone for her sins through reading? Did she redeem herself by learning about the broad history of what happened? What do people think? I mean, she served time in prison, right? I mean, she spent 18 years there. She learned to read and write, and then the things that she read and write were not, classics of literature. They were the classic accounts of the victims and the perpetrators in the Holocaust. Right. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, she essentially kills herself, I think, largely because she can't rejoin society. I mean, she's already completely isolated. She's, I think, gone through her own personal remorse, her own personal kind of catharsis of sorts, which was, I think, learning to read, learning to write, learning about the broader history, learning about the history she was involved with, learning about the victims, learning about the perpetrators. And in the end, I mean, she probably couldn't return to society. I think that, in a sense, suicide was probably the only, at least as we understand this novel, probably the only out that she had. I go.
I believe that in a sense she also passes her guilt onto Michael and the other generation.
That she passes her guilt on to Michael. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing. I mean, that goes this issue of transgenerational, right? I mean, in a sense of both understanding what happened, but in a way, yeah, someone who wasn't there, who didn't do anything, also feels a sense of guilt or responsibility. That's a very profound thing. I think this is often the case. I mean, when I talk to students or people who are, also like, my age, who were obviously not born during the war, there's a sense of, German students especially, feeling guilt for what their parents or grandparents did or what their country did, even though they themselves didn't do anything. Right? So the sense of guilt that kind of goes across generations, a feeling even of shame as well. And I think you're right, that she passes a certain amount of her guilt onto Michael, and perhaps Michael willingly accepts that, or perhaps maybe I don't know willingly, but he certainly that guilt, he's become saddled with it. Yeah, and in many ways, carrying out her last wishes is, I think, also a way of him probably struggling with, what it means to have grown up in a country where these crimes took place, right? Trying to make good. So I want to turn to this last question about forgiveness. So I think this is a really interesting question. It's a question that, is constantly being debated. I think if you talk to different Holocaust victims, they'll say different things. Some could imagine never forgiving perpetrators for what they did. Others could imagine doing so. Many could not. It also has to do with, today, going on very recently in Rwanda, for example, where you have perpetrators and victims confronting each other, like literally like in the same room, where, people who hacked your family to death, with a machete, are talking to you as the one survivor, someone who, managed to make it. This is part of, this also happened, I think, in South Africa with the history of apartheid. These truth and reconciliation committees where people are, confronting what they did and also confronting their victims. And that's a really important thing, right, where the perpetrators and the victims are coming together. And there's a moment where the novel ends where this is obviously no longer possible because Hannah has killed herself, but she can do it through a surrogate. She can do it, I think, through Michael, which is essentially Michael goes to this daughter, and it turns out that you might remember from the church fire, there are two survivors. There's a mother and a daughter, and in fact, the testimony of the mother was part of the reason that Hannah was, found guilty. And the daughter lives in New York and had survived also the church fire with her mom. And Hannah actually has sort of a last wish that she leaves behind. It's on 207. She says in a letter that she had written to Michael that there was still some money in a lavender T10. Give it to Michael Berg. This is, I guess, the warden. Give it to Michael Berg. He should send it, along with the 7,000 marks in the bank, to the daughter who survived the fire in the church with her mother. She should then decide what to do with it and tell him I say hello. So essentially her last wish, the last wish of the perpetrator is that she would give this money, kind of like her life savings, right, to the daughter who survived the church fire, right? I think it is a magnanimous gesture. I think, in some ways a symbolic gesture, a kind of moment of atonement. And eventually he goes and he meets this daughter, right? He goes to New York, and do you remember what her response is? Does she accept it? The money? No. No, she doesn't accept the money. And she has a question that she asks on 212. She says, and grant Frau Schmitz an absolution, like a kind of like a purification, like of getting rid of her sins. She doesn't accept it. She doesn't accept the money. But she does accept something else. She accepts the little tin can that Hannah has, this little tin can. And she says, the daughter says, when I was a little girl, I had a T10 for my treasures. Not like this, although these sorts of T10s already existed. And she says, I brought it with me to the camp, but then one day it was stolen with me. It was stolen from me. And so what she says at the end is, I'll keep the 10. So why do you suppose she keeps the tin can and not takes the money? Right. Yeah, I think one issue here, and this goes back to something we'll talk in the last week of class, is like, how do you compensate victims for what they suffered, right? When Germany pays reparations to victims. I mean, what price do you put on someone suffering? It's like you were in Auschwitz for a year. What's that worth? Is it worth, $10,000, $100,000? You lost your whole family. What kind of reparations are appropriate? You suffered in this camp, $7,000 from the 7,000 marks from the perpetrator. Is there any equivalent? Is there any kind of monetary equivalent? And probably not, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But what she takes is something which is deeply symbolic. And it actually goes back, I think, to, she references the concentration camp. That in the camp, all those things that had meaning, right? The money, the cars, the house, the jewelry, all those things were irrelevant. The only thing that mattered in the concentration camp, and this goes back to Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi, were things like spoons and forks and bowls and tin cans, right? So like these like tiny little objects, right? These seemingly inconsequential, banal things of everyday life. And so the thing that she takes to remind her is not so much to grant redemption, I think, to Hannah Schmitz or absolution, but rather it's a reminder of the kind of transvaluation of these everyday objects which had happened in the camp. And so she keeps the 10 almost like a reminder of, the time when the tin can became, your most prized possession, and most important thing. So, last couple comments, and this is the last thing I want to say. Yeah, this is, I like the novel in some ways. Because obviously I assign it in class because, there's something about it that I find compelling. Part of which has to do with the relationship that happens between Michael Berg and Hannah Schmitz. But it kind of goes back to the point, I forget your name, but that the woman with the red sash was making, the point that you were making earlier, which has to do with why we become sympathetic to Hannah Schmitz. I see this novel, and you can, you don't have to take my interpretation for, you can contest it. But I see this as a kind of wish. In some ways, I think we wish that all the perpetrators were like Hannah Schmitz, meaning that they redeemed themselves, that they atoned for their sins, they read the victims, they understood what happened, they took the trials seriously, they actually engaged and really, in some ways, I guess showed themselves to be sympathetic and humane and human. I think it's a wish. Most of the perpetrators weren't like this. Most of the perpetrators were callous, indignant, arrogant, didn't care, flouted justice, didn't take it seriously. When they were confronted by their victims, they dismissed them. When they were confronted by justice, they fled. Most were not like Hannah Schmitz. Most were people I think that we really can't sympathize with. Most were like the ones we studied. They're like the Eichmanns or the men in the Wannsee Conference or Franz Suchemel, and they were largely smug and arrogant and indignant. The reason I think that this novel is compelling in some ways is because it's a wish. We wish the perpetrators were like this. As I say, we wish they redeemed themselves. Most didn't. Most didn't seek forgiveness. Most didn't learn about their crimes. Most didn't feel sorrow. Most didn't, do the things that she did. And so, part of the reason I think the novel becomes compelling is because we wish that it was like this. And the reality is it wasn't. Any thoughts? So, all right, good. We'll see you on Thursday.